took you long enough.
Sometimes a sequel announcement doesn't just excite fans, it sparks a debate, and right now one of the most talked about sequels in Hollywood is doing exactly that, because after nearly 2 decades, The Devil Wears Prada is finally getting a continuation. And the reaction has been fascinating. Some fans are celebrating the return of Miranda Priestly and the ruthless fashion empire she built. Others are asking a different question entirely: why now? Because if you think about it, the world that The Devil Wears Prada, originally captured in 2006, barely exists anymore. And that's exactly why this sequel might end up being far more interesting than people expect. When the first teaser for The Devil Wears Prada 2 dropped earlier this year, something surprising happened almost immediately. Within 24 hours, the trailer exploded online, collecting more than 200 million views and climbing directly into YouTube's trending charts. That kind of response sends a very clear signal. People are ready to return to this world, but here's the twist. The sequel isn't simply recreating the original story for nostalgia. Instead, it appears to be doing something much more ambitious. It's asking what happens when characters built for a completely different era suddenly find themselves in a world that has completely changed. If you remember the first film, Miranda Priestly ruled the fashion universe as the editor-in-chief of Runway magazine. She was powerful, feared, brilliant, and completely uncompromising, and back then, that power made sense, because in 2006, the fashion industry revolved around magazines. Editors decided trends. Designers fought for their approval. Photographers, stylists, and brands all competed for a place inside those glossy pages. Print media was the gatekeeper. If Runway featured you, your career exploded. If it ignored you, you barely existed. But the world Miranda ruled over has transformed in ways that no one could have predicted back then. Today, fashion influence doesn't come from editors alone. It comes from algorithms, from social media, from influencers who can turn a small trend into a global phenomenon overnight. The runway is no longer the center of the fashion universe. The internet is, and according to the early footage, that shift is at the heart of the sequel story. Miranda Priestly returns as the legendary editor of Runway magazine, but this time she's stepping into an environment where the rules of power have changed dramatically. Traditional magazines are struggling to survive. Digital media moves faster than any print publication ever could. Viral content matters more than editorial authority, and perhaps most importantly, attention has become the most valuable currency in the industry, which means the new gatekeepers aren't editors, they're platforms, and the trailer suggests Miranda may not fully accept that reality. Instead, we see her clinging to the same commanding presence that made her such an unforgettable character in the first film. She still delivers those ice-cold looks. She still walks through the office like she owns the building, but this time, the world around her might not respond the same way. One of the most interesting developments in the sequel involves Emily Charlton, the razor-sharp assistant played by Emily Blunt in the original movie. Back then, Emily lived and breathed Runway. She was loyal to Miranda, ambitious to the point of obsession, and willing to sacrifice almost anything to stay inside that elite fashion world. Now things have changed. In the new film, Emily has become the CEO of a luxury brand conglomerate, which means something remarkable has happened. She now controls the advertising budgets that Runway desperately needs to survive. That instantly flips the power dynamic between her and Miranda. And if you remember the tension between those two characters in the first film, you already know how entertaining that battle could become. The sequel seems ready to lean directly into that conflict. Two powerful women, two completely different visions of the fashion industry, and one rapidly changing media landscape. That forces them to confront the future. Of course, another major return is Anne Hathaway's Andy Sachs. Andy was originally the outsider entering Miranda's brutal fashion empire. She started the story as a journalist with no interest in fashion, only to slowly transform as she climbed deeper into that world. Now she returns older, more confident, and far more self-assured. In fact, the trailer hints at a moment where Miranda doesn't even recognize her at first, which feels like a perfect metaphor for how much time has passed. And then there's Nigel. Stanley Tucker's beloved character once again appears to serve as the emotional anchor of the story. In the original film, Nigel was the one person who truly understood both the glamour and the cruelty of the fashion industry. He believed in the art of fashion, But he also saw the cost of chasing it. That moral perspective may become even more important this time around because the world surrounding these characters has undergone a cultural transformation that goes far beyond fashion. When the first movie came out in 2006, audiences could view Miranda Priestly as a fascinating boss. Harsh, demanding, but also brilliant. Many people even admired her. Today, that perspective is far more complicated. Over the last decade, conversations about workplace power dynamics have changed dramatically. The meta movement forced industries everywhere to confront toxic leadership, abuse of authority, and the impact of hostile work environments. Suddenly, characters like Miranda Priestly don't exist in a vacuum anymore. They exist inside a world where leadership styles are being questioned more openly than ever before, and that makes the sequel particularly interesting, because it gives the story an opportunity to revisit Miranda not just as a symbol of power, but as a reflection of how our understanding of leadership has evolved. Is she still a genius ahead of her time? Or is she a relic of an industry that refuses to adapt? The film also arrives at a moment when women in leadership positions continue to face impossible expectations, too strong and they're labeled aggressive, too empathetic and they're considered weak. Social media amplifies criticism in ways that didn't exist when the original film premiered. Harassment, body shaming, and online hostility remain everyday realities. All of that creates a complicated landscape for female characters in positions of authority. Which means that Devil Wears Prada 2 has the opportunity to do something the original film never fully explored. It can show what power looks like for women, navigating a modern world that constantly judges them from every direction. Of course, part of the excitement surrounding the sequel comes from something simpler: nostalgia. Fans are eager to revisit those iconic locations. The sharp dialogue, the unforgettable wardrobe, the glamorous chaos of the fashion industry, and the film seems ready to deliver those elements. The teaser already hints at a soundtrack that blends past and present, even bringing Madonna's Vogue back into the conversation as a nod to the original film's legacy. But beneath the nostalgia, there's a clear sense that the filmmakers want to push the story forward rather than simply repeat it. Fashion itself has changed, media has changed, power has changed, and the sequel appears determined to examine what happens when characters built for one era must suddenly confront another. Miranda Priestly was once the ultimate authority in fashion. Now she's entering a battlefield where influence comes from millions of voices instead of a single editor's decision. That conflict alone could redefine the character, and if the film leans fully into that tension, The Devil Wears Prada 2 might become something far more interesting than a simple reunion. It could become a commentary on how industries evolve and how power struggles adapt with them. Whether the sequel ultimately succeeds or not remains to be seen, but one thing is already clear: the return of Miranda, Andy, Emily, and Nigel isn't just about revisiting the past. It's about watching those characters collide with a future they never expected. This is Screen Radar, and if you enjoy exploring the stories behind Hollywood's biggest sequels, industry shifts, and iconic characters returning to the spotlight, stay tuned for the next breakdown.